What kind of ruler makes his horse a priest, invites it to dinner, and whispers to it in the marital bed? This was not a fable, nor the ravings of Rome's enemies. This was Caligula, the most infamous emperor in Roman history. A man whose thirst for power, humiliation, and grotesque spectacle pushed the empire into an abyss of madness. His story is not just one of excess, but of obsession, betrayal, and a downfall so bloody that even the whispers of his reign still curdle the blood nearly 2,000 years later. Chapter 1. The Monster on the Throne. When Caligula first took the throne in the year 37, Rome thought it had found salvation. His predecessor, Tiberius, had been a paranoid recluse who ruled from an island fortress, drowning the empire in fear. The people rejoiced when Caligula, young, handsome, and a direct descendant of Augustus, stepped forward as emperor. They called him their golden boy, the child of destiny. For a brief moment, Rome believed the nightmare was over. But the nightmare was only beginning. Within months, Caligula's charm curdled into cruelty. He demanded absolute submission, not just from enemies, but from Rome's most powerful men. Senators were forced to run beside his chariot like slaves, drenched in sweat as the emperor laughed from above. Others were invited to his banquets only to be humiliated, stripped of dignity, mocked before the crowd, reduced to playthings for his amusement. Caligula wasn't satisfied with ruling Rome. He wanted to break it. He wanted to bend its traditions, its nobility, and even its gods beneath his will. Power alone wasn't enough. He wanted domination, humiliation, and spectacle. And it was in this theater of cruelty that one figure began to rise, a creature no senator could rival, no nobleman could compete with. Caligula's most trusted companion, the one he cherished above all others, was not a wife, not a general, not even a god. It was his horse. Chapter 2. Incitatus, the Living God. His name was Incitatus, the Swift One, a stallion so cherished by Caligula that the emperor raised him higher than the noblest blood in Rome. This was no ordinary animal. Incitatus dined from ivory troughs, drank wine from golden goblets, and slept in a stable made of marble. His bedding was dyed purple, the color reserved for emperors, and guards stood watch to ensure that no noise disturbed his slumber. But Caligula's devotion went beyond indulgence. He announced that his beloved horse would be made consul, one of the highest political offices in Rome. Senators were forced to nod in silence, choking back their disgust as their emperor prepared to elevate a beast above them. It was not a joke. It was a humiliation ritual, a grotesque declaration that Caligula's horse was more worthy of power than the men who governed the empire. At his banquets, Incitatus was not just a guest, he was the guest of honor. Cushioned on purple pillows, he was served delicacies alongside Rome's elite, as if the empire's fate rested not in the hands of generals or statesmen, but in the hooves of a stallion. Senators raised their cups in trembling hands as Caligula toasted not to Rome, not to victory, but to his horse. And the whispers grew darker. Ancient sources hint that the emperor's bond with Incitatus was not merely symbolic. Some claimed Caligula shared his bed with the animal, whispering to it as though it were his lover, a grotesque parody of marriage meant to mock the very sanctity of Roman society. Whether truth or rumor, the effect was the same. Rome was forced to imagine their emperor entwined with a beast, and in that vision lay the deepest humiliation. But this was only the beginning. For the horse was not just a favored pet, not just a tool of mockery. Caligula was about to drag Incitatus into the sacred heart of Rome's religion, and in doing so, he would commit a blasphemy that still echoes like a curse through history. Chapter 3. Grotesque Rituals and Rumors. The banquets of Caligula became infamous, not for their luxury, but for their perversions. Senators and nobles sat in gilded halls, sweating under the weight of silence, as servants carried in dishes fit not for men, but for Incitatus. Oats mixed with flecks of gold, wine poured into jewel-crusted bowls, fruits draped in honey. Rome's most powerful men watched in shame as a horse ate better than they did. Yet it was not the food that haunted them. It was the rituals. Caligula often raised his cup and commanded senators to toast not to him, not to Rome, but to Incitatus. These were no longer feasts. They were ceremonies, spectacles of humiliation, where men who once commanded legions now bowed their heads before an animal, and darker whispers spread from these halls. Whispers that Caligula would dress Incitatus in fine linens, seating him at the head of the table like a priest, as if officiating over a grotesque sacrament. Whispers that he visited the horse in the night, whispering into its ear in the privacy of his chambers. Some even claimed, though no one dared speak it aloud without trembling, that the emperor shared more than words with the beast, consummating his madness in rituals too obscene for history to record in detail. Historians still debate whether these stories were slanders, invented to blacken Caligula's memory after his bloody reign ended. But even if rumor exaggerated the truth, the effect was the same. The Roman world came to see their emperor not just as a tyrant, but as something unholy. For in Caligula's Rome, the boundaries between man and beast, ruler and god, sacred and profane, had been deliberately shattered. The emperor was not merely mocking tradition, he was defiling it. And yet Caligula's appetite for humiliation did not end with a horse at the banquet table. What he brought into Rome's temples would turn laughter into horror and rumor into blasphemy. Chapter 4. The Theater of Humiliation. Caligula's cruelty was never private. He turned Rome itself into a stage, and humiliation was his performance art. Senators, men whose ancestors had built the Republic, were summoned to kneel before his horse, stroking its mane as if paying tribute to a god. Some were forced to kiss Incitatus's hooves, while others were ordered to dine beside the beast, chewing in silence as the emperor cackled from his throne. But the degradation did not end there. Noble women, wives and daughters of Rome's most honored families, were summoned to his chambers only to be paraded like livestock, stripped of dignity, before crowds that dared not look away. He auctioned their favors at banquets, as though Rome's bloodlines were his personal marketplace. To Caligula, their shame was the finest entertainment. Every act was calculated, each grotesque display designed to remind Rome that its traditions, its honor, and even its gods now bent beneath his will. Senators who once debated policy now trembled like slaves, afraid to breathe too loudly in his presence. The empire had become his circus, and Rome's greatest men its jesters. And yet, there was one arena left where Caligula's thirst for domination would reach its most blasphemous heights: the temples, Rome's sacred heart. If he could defile its gods, then nothing, not man nor heaven, would stand above him. But what he did there would not just mock tradition, it would corrupt it forever. Chapter 5. Playing God. In Rome, the gods were sacred. They guarded the empire, blessed its armies, and were honored with rituals that had been performed for centuries. But in Caligula's reign, the temples became theaters of desecration. He did not worship the gods, he replaced them. Draped in costumes stolen from the statues of Jupiter and Apollo, Caligula paraded through the streets, demanding that citizens bow to him as if to a living deity. At one feast he appeared dressed as Venus, adorned in silks and jewels, his face painted like a goddess, mocking the very boundaries of man and divine. He commanded that temples once dedicated to Rome's gods be rededicated to himself. Incense no longer rose to Jupiter, it rose to Caligula. But his blasphemy did not stop with his own image. He brought Incitatus into the sacred rituals, elevating the horse beyond the status of a beast. Some claimed he had the animal garlanded with jewels and paraded into temples, forcing priests and senators to offer prayers before its hooves. Others whispered that he demanded sacrifices in the horse's name, a grotesque parody of religion where the sacred blood flowed not for Rome's gods, but for a stallion. To mock the Jews, he even ordered a statue of himself placed inside the Temple of Jerusalem, an act so outrageous it nearly sparked open rebellion. To Caligula, nothing was beyond defilement. The gods themselves were pawns in his theater of power. But the emperor's hunger for humiliation and spectacle was insatiable. If he could make the heavens bow, then he believed the earth itself would follow. And so his madness deepened, into cruelty, into paranoia, and into blood. Chapter 6. The Descent into Madness. The deeper Caligula sank into his delusions, the more Rome bled for his amusement. The banquets of humiliation gave way to arenas of slaughter. Citizens were dragged into the Colosseum to face wild beasts, not as criminals, but as entertainment when Caligula grew bored of gladiators. He laughed as men were torn apart, treating their deaths as the punchline to his private joke. Execution became his favorite spectacle. Senators, generals, even family members were struck down on the faintest suspicion of disloyalty. He did not kill quietly. He killed publicly, drawing out the suffering so Rome could see the fate of those who dared to displease him. There were whispers that he forced fathers to watch the execution of their sons, or invited widows to banquet halls where the severed heads of their husbands were displayed among the wine and flowers. His madness was not just cruelty, it was waste. He ordered bridges built out of ships lashed together across the sea, a vanity project designed so he could gallop incitatus across the waves as if defying the gods themselves. Rome's treasury groaned under the weight of his extravagance, while the people starved. Yet any complaint, any hesitation, could mean death. Paranoia consumed him. He saw betrayal everywhere, in the Senate, in the Guard, even in his own palace. He armed himself with daggers, surrounded himself with spies, and slept little, convinced that conspirators lurked in every shadow. The emperor who once played God was now haunted like a hunted animal, lashing out with blood-soaked fury at all who approached him. But Rome's patience was not infinite. His cruelty, his mockery, his madness, all had pushed the empire past breaking point. And while Caligula strutted as a living god, whispering to his horse and bathing in blood, others were sharpening blades in the dark. Chapter 7: Betrayal in the Shadows. By the end of his reign, Caligula was not merely feared, he was despised. Senators loathed him for stripping them of dignity. Nobles whispered of their shame in serving his horse. The treasury lay empty, drained by his grotesque spectacles, and even the Praetorian Guard, sworn to protect him, now whispered in the shadows. The emperor had made too many enemies. He mocked Rome's traditions, defiled its gods, and bled its coffers dry. But worst of all, he humiliated the very men who held the power of the sword. His guards had been forced to endure his cruelty in silence, beaten, insulted, treated as pawns in his sadistic games. For soldiers, loyalty has limits, and Caligula had shattered them all. In secret, blades were drawn and oaths exchanged. The conspiracy was small, but it spread like rot through the marble halls of the palace. Even senators who dared not act themselves gave quiet approval, knowing that if Caligula fell, Rome might breathe again. But the emperor suspected nothing. He believed himself untouchable, a god in human flesh. He strode through the palace with the arrogance of immortality, his horse groomed like royalty, his court still forced to kneel before his madness. If whispers reached him, he dismissed them with laughter. How could men kill a god? Yet gods bleed. And Caligula was about to learn that even an emperor can be butchered like an animal. Chapter 8: The Bloody End of Caligula. It happened not on the battlefield, nor in the Senate, but in the narrow corridors of his own palace. Caligula had just finished attending a theatrical performance, a play he mocked as dull, jeering at the actors and laughing while Rome's elite were forced to clap at his every word. Surrounded by guards, smug and unshaken, he stepped into the passageway that led back to his chambers. But the shadows were waiting. As the emperor walked, a soldier struck him from behind with a blade. Caligula staggered, his voice rising not in command, but in shock. Another blade followed, plunging into his ribs. He screamed, but his cries only fueled the frenzy. Guards who had once bowed at his feet now hacked him apart like butchers in a slaughterhouse. The man who declared himself a god died gasping for air, blood spilling across the marble floor. Some accounts say he was stabbed more than 30 times, his body reduced to a shredded carcass. Others claim he pleaded for mercy, calling out like a child as his killers carved him open. Whatever the truth, the end was not noble, not divine. It was grotesque, bloody, and pitiful. His corpse was left mangled, stripped of dignity, until loyalists carried it away in secret, burning it in haste to prevent it from being desecrated further. Incitatus, the horse that had been dressed in purple and honored like a priest, vanished from history, a silent ghost left behind in the wake of madness. The empire moved on, but the whispers did not. For Rome would never forget the emperor who crowned his horse as consul, who dined with beasts, who played God, and who died like an animal. The tale of Caligula is more than a story of madness. It is a warning about power without limits. He mocked the gods, humiliated Rome, and crowned a horse as his closest companion. Whether the darkest rumors were truth or slander, one fact remains undeniable. His reign left behind a stain so grotesque that even centuries later, his name is whispered as a curse. History remembers kings and emperors for their victories, their laws, their monuments. But Caligula is remembered for something far darker, a legacy of blasphemy, cruelty, and blood. And perhaps the most chilling thought of all is this. He believed he was untouchable, that he was a god walking among mortals. Yet in the end, even Caligula was cut down like an animal in the dirt. If you want more forbidden stories of rulers, popes, and monarchs whose lives descended into horror, subscribe to Twisted Facts Vault. Leave a like if this tale disturbed you, and join us again for the secrets history tried to bury. Secrets even darker than Caligula's reign.